Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kari Murphy. I am the Assistant Executive Director and Director of Diversity here at the Columbus Bar Association. Again, thank you for being here. This is the first in our series of community conversations exploring race and the criminal justice system. This conversation is focused on one aspect of that system, and that is public trust in policing. Here to offer their insights are City Attorney Zach Klein and Senior Legal Analyst at the Kerwin Institute, Kyle Strickland. Thanks to you both for being here. The format for today's conversation will begin with our guests offering a little bit of background about their experience in this area. From there, they'll lead us in a brief overview on the topic to help guide our conversation today. The remaining time that we have together will be devoted to questions from you, our attendees, weighing in on the things that are most important to you. With that in mind, you can submit questions at any time, and you'll do that using the Q&A function. For those of you who are participating by phone, the Q&A button is typically right at the top of your screen. It's very small and it says Q&A. For those of you who are participating by video, or excuse me, on your computer, the Q&A function is typically at the bottom of your screen. Those questions that are submitted there will be relayed to our guests throughout today's session. And as with many of our community conversation topics that we begin with today, but we'll be continuing with throughout the year, public trust in policing can include issues that inspire passion, conviction, anger, and sometimes deep pain. Our community conversations are an environment where respect, curiosity, and empathy are not just encouraged, but they are in fact required. Questions or comments that fall short of that requirement will not be addressed. Again, on behalf of the Columbus Bar Association, thank you all for being here, for your openness and willingness to engage in productive dialogue, and for leaning into one of the pressing issues of our day. City Attorney Klein, Zach, let's begin with you.
Thanks, Kari. I appreciate it. And to my fellow members of the bar, thanks for stopping in for this lunchtime discussion with my friend Kyle Strickland and I. To talk about, I think, something really important in our own community and across the country, and that's, the intersection of race in the criminal justice system and policing. And so I think it's important, at least from my perspective, to kind of know that criminal justice reform, when we talk about it, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily mean policing reform. There are significant overlaps, but they're not the same thing. And when you look at the criminal justice system holistically, however, it obviously begins with an interaction with a police officer and could go all the way up to a time or a prison sentence or a jail sentence, and then followed by maybe probation or parole. And so what I've tried to do as the Columbus City Attorney in my tenure is deal with and reform the way that we're looking at the criminal justice system within my control as a prosecutor. And my control and ability to use our prosecutorial discretion to make a difference, to improve the inequities, to erase the inequities and improve the criminal justice system. And then more recently, we, because of the death of Mr. Floyd, we have, really transitioned to also think about and reimagine the way that we police, and we hold police accountability based on what our community's expectations are and what we expect of police. So I'm been the city attorney in Columbus for the past 3 years, and it's been just an incredible opportunity to serve the city and to kind of touch briefly on some of our criminal justice courtroom measures. Over those past 3 years, we have eliminated cash bail for nonviolent misdemeanors, absent unique circumstances. So when our prosecutors are presented with a recommendation to a judge, our recommendation, unless there's a reason to do so, we ask for non-cash bail for nonviolent misdemeanors. Also made the decision that we no longer prosecute misdemeanor marijuana cases in the city of Columbus. Now, that doesn't mean that marijuana is illegal, because the Ohio Revised Code still makes it an illegal substance, and police still certainly have the ability to do constitutional searches associated with marijuana possession. But we simply have made the affirmative decision that we're not prosecuting misdemeanor marijuana possession. Another criminal justice reform program that we've done, which really, I think, goes to the heart of the problems of the criminal justice system. So we've created the first of its kind diversion program that looks at the root reasons of crime. We start peeling back the layers of why people are in the courtroom as a defendant to begin with. And that certainly includes drug addiction and mental health. But what makes our program unique is it includes drug addiction and mental health, but it also asks questions about food insecurity, housing, employment, transportation issues. And we've partnered with a third-party healthcare organization that is independent from our office that does a 36-question screen of the defendants that want to participate in this program. And that screen, that questionnaire, it does ask for the questions relating to food, relating to housing, relating to employment. And based on what those answers are, the success of the diversion program and the requirements of the diversion program are such that if you have a food or a food insecurity, then it's to visit your local food pantry. If you have a housing issue, it's connecting you with a housing agency. It's really trying to take a step back and not so much focus on conviction rates, which has been, I think, the focus in the criminal justice system for the past 40 years, is how do I have the highest conviction rate? And trust me, convictions are still important. There are very dangerous people in this world that need to be incarcerated. But for folks that have true problems and barriers to success that then lead them to commit crime, which is why, for example, we're piloting this program in theft, big box theft. It's like, why are they stealing? And how do we, instead of focusing on conviction rates, we focus instead on recidivism rates as a way to truly make our community safer? Because if you can't identify and address the underlying root reason why someone commits a crime, adding a conviction to their record and a couple of days in jail perhaps is not going to eliminate the fact that they may have a drug addiction problem, or they may have a food insecurity that will continue to require them to do what it takes to feed them or their family. So it's taking a step back and reimagining how we can truly make our community safer by getting at the root reasons of crime. Certainly over the past couple of weeks, with the protests across the country in our community, we have put a higher significant interest on how we can rethink and reimagine policing accountability and reform in the city of Columbus. I put out my own 8 reforms, and I'm proud to announce that we've accomplished many of those already. And just to briefly go through those, and I can certainly, should the audience be interested, go into them in further depth if needed. But the first 4 reforms out of the 8 focus on the protests themselves. You know, what happened in our community? How did and how do we address those? The second 4 have to do with the underlying reasons why people are protesting, not just in Columbus, but across the country. So the first 4 are to appoint an independent, objective, outside entity or person to do a complete top to bottom review of how the city of Columbus handled its protests. This is a macro level review of response, policies, procedures, communications. And I'm proud to announce that yesterday I'm sorry, not yesterday, time flies. Wednesday, we announced that Carter Stewart, the former United States Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, in conjunction with the Glenn College at The Ohio State University, will be leading that response for our city. I think this is important for 2 reasons. One is to allow the community to heal, to have an objective, independent analysis of what we got right, so that we can celebrate those things and continue them, but also identify and fix what we got wrong, so that we can truly be a nationwide leader on large protests and protecting the First Amendment, but also protecting the community, businesses, and police. The second and third are tied together. It has to do with the use of chemical agents during protests. We have changed the policy in the city of Columbus as it relates to pepper spray, and we have changed it as it relates to tear gas. And I think it's important to note that those are different chemicals. A lot of times people lump them together as the same chemical. They're different. As it relates to pepper spray, police, under the new policies and procedures that were enacted, can only use pepper spray if the crowd is aggressive or violent, and it can never be used for the sole purpose to clear a street. The same can be said for tear gas. Tear gas, under the new policy, is banned for the purpose of crowd control. So tear gas cannot be used for crowd control measures. We're certainly seeing that going on right now in Portland and continuing, for example. The third has to do with an overview of the police's requirements or interests in clearing the streets. I think that when you have looked back over the past 6 to 8 weeks of the protests in our community, you see that a lot of the friction between police and the protesters tend to come when police try to clear the street. And there's certainly a public safety reason to make sure we do have a clear street for the safety of protesters, because traffic could be present, for the safety of police officers. But how do you balance that clearing the street requirement, because it is the law, but also balance that against the interest of First Amendment protests? The fourth has to do with submitting and reviewing individual instances of alleged police misconduct. Those are currently being done as we speak. I have my chief prosecutor, who, at the request of the Division of Police, as well as at the request of the Columbus Department of Public Safety, reviewing in the individual allegations that have been submitted by people on this call, people in the community. And we have referred some of those to criminal investigation, which is being done independently of the Division of Police. It's being done by Rick Wozniak, who's a former and retired FBI agent. He's doing those criminal investigations, and then my office will be appointing an independent prosecutor to make any ultimate probable cause determinations and potentially prosecute those cases. My office could certainly do it. We have the expertise, and we have great lawyers, as I know many of the lawyers on this call interact with our wonderful lawyers in the prosecution division. But I thought, for the utmost independence and for the potential conflict of interest that my office may have in these cases, that it would be great to have an outside independent prosecutor evaluate those, that is separate from my office, where we have no influence. Incidentally, the Department of Public Safety also asked the law firm Baker and Hostetler to review those non-criminal allegations, the ones that still may violate policy and could lead to employment discipline, but does not rise to the level of criminal conduct. And the law firm Baker and Hostetler is doing that independent of what has historically and traditionally been done through the CPD's Internal Affairs Bureau. So those are the four dealing with the protest in the most immediate way, the things and the actions and the results that happened in our backyard over the past 6 to 8 weeks. And the next four have to do with not forgetting about why people took to the streets to begin with, the underlying reasons why people are protesting. And those are, a support of the Civilian Review Board, which the mayor and I and council announced this week, to put on a ballot initiative that I believe fits within the current contours of the FOP contract. I'm still a firm believer in collective bargaining in this state for all those who are interested in being part of a labor unit, and certainly our public sector employees. And I think the way that we have structured this charter review amendment allows for the respect of collective bargaining, but also allows for hopefully successful future collective bargaining with the FOP and the City of Columbus through ordinance of council to only strengthen the Civilian Review Board that is outlined, and the basis of which is described in this charter amendment that hopefully the voters of the City of Columbus will pass this November. The next is bringing charging decisions away from CPD and into the city attorney's office in the very similar way that the Franklin County prosecutor's office does it. For lack of better description, essentially creating a mini grand jury unit that reviews all of the files and complaints that are submitted, the U-10s, for those who are familiar, that the police officers fill out. My office will review those and ultimately determine what, if any, charges should be filed. So we would have more control over what the docket is, and ensure that the cases are charged properly, that the cases can be prosecuted beyond a reasonable doubt. The next is what I think that is one that I'm particularly interested in, and it's one that I think that any city in the United States can do, and that is a comprehensive review of our city's pedestrian, traffic, and bicycle laws. I think that anecdotally, that I know and I'm confident will be backed by stats. People of color, primarily Black men, have told me in my tenure with the City of Columbus about negative interactions with police that have to do with a traffic stop, a bicycle stop, or pedestrian stop. So I think it's fair to take a step back, look at the efficacy of those results, of those stops, the results that come of them, and figure out a way if some of the laws that we have in the City of Columbus should be, as it relates to pedestrian equipment and bicycle laws, whether they should be secondary offenses, for example, in the same way as seatbelt offenses. So it cannot be the primary reason someone is pulled over. Now, obviously, running a stop sign or running a red light may not be one we want to make a secondary offense, but there could be a whole list of current laws that exist that my office is currently reviewing, as well as pulling data from the clerk's office over the past 3 years to look at the racial breakdown of who has been subjected to these pedestrian, bicycle, and traffic stops. And again, how do we eliminate unnecessary interactions between the police and the community as a way to build community trust? Because if someone leaves that interaction with a negative connotation or a negative thought, that only erodes community trust that we're trying to build with police and our citizens. And then the final one is, rethinking and adding part of the training program, a cultural immersion experience, where police officers, recruits, trainees, before they get a badge and gun, spend time in the communities in which they're going to police. Because a lot of folks, and this is not a negative thing because I came from Southeastern Ohio and Appalachia as well, but a lot of our police recruits simply don't come from big cities or urban areas. And again, that doesn't make them bad people, but it just means that they have limited interactions with people who are not like them, whether that's African-American, LGBTQ, different cultures, different religions. And so how do we, prior to them getting a badge and a gun, break down the stereotypes and the perceptions that folks may get because they don't interact with people different than them, that they get from the internet or from movies or from TV. And we give them the real opportunity to meet and the community leaders and work in the neighborhoods that they serve prior to it being in an enforcement oversight role. We're doing other things, but I want to make sure Kyle gets a chance to speak, but that's the broad overview of what we're doing. But I will say that we've spent 80% of our time over the past 6 to 8 weeks really focused on how we can improve policing in our community and build upon what great work is already being done by the Division of Police, only to make us better. So Kyle, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Zach, and thank you, Kari, and the Columbus Bar Association, and then everybody who's joining by phone today and by web. Really wanted to kind of give perspective on kind of from my end. So basically, my background, legal policy at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And at the Kirwan Institute, we focus on issues of implicit bias, but also things like structural racism. So looking at both the interpersonal level engagement with individuals. So those are the unconscious attitudes, the biases that people have that actually perpetuate discrimination. Those can be intentional or unintentional, but these biases lead to all sorts of issues, especially when it comes to the criminal justice system, whether it's interactions with the police, as well as interactions within all sorts of actors within our society. So we look at it through that lens and that angle, and all of that is influenced by media, by life experiences, by where you grow up. All these different factors come into play and have these biases that we all hold. And so we have to learn and unlearn some of these biases to make sure that we're not actually perpetuating inequality without even knowing it. And then on top of the implicit bias angle, we also look at it through the lens of structural racism. So that's looking at the structural factors. What does the history of our country's laws, policies, and practices have on perpetuating biases and perpetuating discrimination? We cannot talk about the inequality and despair that we see today without being able to connect that to the inequalities that were baked in to this country since its founding. And so the reason why it's important to look at that through these angles is because you are never going to get to the root causes of issues like poverty or issues of crime if you are not looking at all the systemic and structural barriers that persist and continue to persist all the way through today. And so how does this relate, especially in the work of criminal justice, but also in policing and public trust? Well, if we don't have that center focus about getting at the root, then people tend to blame crime and poverty on individuals themselves. And the result is a system that just punishes people rather than looking at restorative practices, looking at rehabilitation, but also looking at other root causes that lead to crime in the first place. And that's why it's so critical the moment we're in to talk about what does it mean to reimagine community safety? Because for far too long, and especially as a result of our country's failed war on drugs, the process has been to lock people up and throw the key away. We know that hasn't worked. Research shows that doesn't work. You can't just punish, punish, punish and expect things to change. And instead, we have to do things like investing in communities. So going beyond just the scope and realm of criminal justice, how are we looking at healthcare? How are we looking at our education system? How are we looking at things like economic justice? So these are all factors that come into play that we have to really squarely focus in on. And it's also something that everybody has a role to play in. You don't have to be somebody who's engaged in the criminal justice space to know that you have a role to play in addressing some of these issues, especially when it comes to the conversation that we're all having at the city level and that City Attorney Klein just mentioned, which is about what are we looking at when it comes to not just the short term, because there are short-term issues that we have to deal with, but also those longer-term impacts. Why are we having these maybe minor infractions or police stops that actually turn out to be, and we see nationally, can end up turning deadly, of something that didn't even have to happen in the first place? How do we start looking at squaring and focusing resources on intense violent crime, and then figuring out other ways to handle and address issues that deal with community safety and public health, looking at public health responses in many of these crises? So one of the roles that I'm playing is on the Civilian Review Board working group that the mayor just appointed not too long ago. And again, as City Attorney Klein just mentioned, we are in the process of, they're going to be putting it on the ballot for the citizens to vote on. But one of the key pieces here is for us to talk about the need for this to have any sort of real authority, right? Because you have to have some independence with some teeth to it in order for that to be effective. And this is something that folks of all walks should welcome. We want to make sure that when given the type of powers and responsibilities that our police departments have, we need to make sure that there's accountability with it. Because when there's no accountability or a lack of accountability, what we tend to see then is the types of over and over injustice. We see the types of mistrust in community when you are talking about policing to solve all of our problems, and instead looking at other aspects and other avenues to make sure that there's accountability. That's why there's great conversations that are happening about where are we putting our funds as a city, where are we focusing those funds and those resources on? How are we investing our budgets? Budgets are moral documents. Where are we putting those dollars in? So these are all pieces that play a role for us to look at. But ultimately, none of this will change anything in the long term if we don't have leaders who are invested in the long-term responsibility that it takes to build community trust. And a part of that community trust is also welcoming and recognizing that, especially as elected leaders, but also as policymakers and people in positions of power, and many of you as attorneys, that we have to be able to figure out ways in which we're holding ourselves accountable, figuring out areas where we've fallen short, and to be able to take criticism, not as some sort of personal indictment, but as an opportunity to learn and grow and listen on where we can make changes happen. And that's, I think, the role that everyone can play in, and especially when it comes to having a conversation around racial justice. We've got to be able to talk about race. And this is something that a lot of folks are uncomfortable in talking about, but we have to be able to talk about the issue of race and racism in America. And so I'm happy to be a part of this conversation today to really engage with some of these discussions, but also to figure out ways in which we can build that long-term trust and accountability and reimagine community safety more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both to Zach and to Kyle, for your introductory remarks. And we do have several questions that are coming in, so we're going to just jump right to those. For now, I'm going to go in the order that they're received. As they start to develop themes, we may start to group some of those together and go a bit out of order. But the first question that we received deals with the policies that are being developed here locally coming out of, I believe this was directed for Zach, but coming out of your office, how are those policies delivered or relayed, excuse me, to line prosecutors? What does that process look like?
Sure. Thanks, Kari. One of the things that I did, and I would encourage, especially in our work from home status, if people have some extra time, is to Google the name Adam Foss, F-O-S-S. Adam did a TED Talk that went viral. He's a African-American male, and he's a former prosecutor from Massachusetts. And he did a TED Talk that went viral about rethinking the role of a prosecutor. And because it went viral, he had a lot of folks reach out to him about taking that message and spreading it to prosecutors around the country. And I got to know Adam actually when I ran for county prosecutor in 2016, which everyone knows on this call that I ultimately lost that race. But I got to know Adam really well during that process. And when I became city attorney, I reached out to him and his group, which is called Prosecutor Impact. And Prosecutor Impact has come to Columbus and has done training with me and my team that was about 2 weeks in length, where we take a step back as prosecutors. And again, to Kyle's point and to what I was saying earlier, we think about the intersectionality of race, of poverty, and the criminal justice system. And we reimagine and rethink the role the prosecutor can play. The war on drugs and the way that we have prosecuted cases in this country for decades, in a lot of ways has been a failure. It's that old adage of doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. And so seeking maximum penalties for folks who are not dangerous to society, only to take them out of their family unit and to incarcerate them for years, if not decades, and then having them re-enter society without any help to allow them to be moms and dads we want to be. And again, we're not talking about necessarily violent criminals. We're talking about people who have drug addiction or mental health problems. We have caused a lot of significant pain and barriers, especially in communities of color and Black communities specifically, by the way that we've prosecuted. So how do we rethink our role as prosecutors? Not so much to always focus on conviction rates, but to look holistically at how we can make our community safer by investing in people and using the role of the prosecutor to do that. And so when Adam came here and did our 2-week training with him and his team, it involved all of my line prosecutors. And we have set up and developed a system where all of us are working together, headed by Melanie Tobias and Joe Gibson, who are the leaders in my prosecutor division, to have a free flow of information, a free flow of thought and ideas that go up and down the chain, so that everyone feels invested for the reasons why we are prosecutors to begin with, and appreciate the important and monumental role we play over the control and destiny of someone's life, and how we have to differentiate those who are truly dangerous. For example, lots of domestic violence cases, where we're not afraid to ask for jail time, from those who have significant socio-determinant barriers, who are not necessarily dangerous people, but need help, and historically have simply been prosecuted for the sake of convictions without taking a step back and giving them the opportunity and hope that they deserve so they can be the moms and dads they want to be. And also be productive members of society, be taxpayers, and not commit crime again, which I think is the ultimate goal of the justice system to begin with, is how we rehabilitate and make our community safer. So through the Prosecutor Impact, we call it PI, through the PI training, we have empowered our prosecutors and set up systems where they understand from a top-down message that starts with me and then flows to Melanie and Joe and then down the chain, that is the perspective of how we want to handle cases. But they're also empowered with the ability to move information up the chain to let us know, because they're in the courtroom every day, how we can continue to move that ball down the field.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Kyle, is there any comment that you wanted to make as it relates to that question about the impacts that it has more broadly?
No, I think that's great. I mean, I would just echo, I had the chance to meet Adam when I was back in law school, when he was just kind of getting started to talk about the issues with Prosecutor Impact. So it's great to see that come to Columbus. I think that is an important step in terms of how we address some of these issues. We've got to look at the root causes and really evaluate our policies and practices. That's, especially if you're looking at different jurisdictions across the country or jurisdictions across the state, one of the first questions you got to be asking is, what are you doing internally to review your own practices, your own policies? Because if you're not making the internal steps, then that's a first step you've got to go in order to make the necessary changes.
Thank you. Okay, the next question that we have coming in is, was edited, so I'm going to jump down to the edited version. And that is, again, this question is directed to the city attorney's office, but is that office going to push for a cut for funding for police, understanding that there isn't control over the budgets, but is your office, Zach, going to advocate for that and have conversations with other city leaders with that purpose in mind?
So what I'm going to advocate for is reimagining policing. I am not a person who believes in defunding the police. I'm not a person who believes in abolish the police. I think that there are very dangerous people in this world, and police play a very important role in protecting us and keeping us safe. That doesn't mean that we have asked police and really the entire criminal justice system to handle more than it ever was intended to handle. I think that we have taken issues like addiction, homelessness, mental health, and those are the direct issues. And then there's indirect issues about housing and food insecurity and how that interplays with crime. And we have asked the criminal justice system, and the frontline players of this are police and prosecutors, but we've asked them to handle all of these things that traditionally probably should be handled elsewhere. And I think when we reimagine policing in the United States, it's really looking at, is the right investment to deal with homelessness to send a uniformed officer by him or herself to deal with a homeless person who's standing on the side of the road asking for $1 to get a cup of coffee, or who's sitting downtown up against a building. That doesn't mean that some of those interactions don't go sideways and can escalate quickly, and a police presence may be necessary, but perhaps the first interaction, direct interaction with secondary support, would be primary interaction with a social worker with secondary support from a police officer. So how do we reimagine the way that we are delivering these services and helping those who are in need? And I think for far too long, we have kind of swept all of these societal problems into the criminal justice bucket, and we continue to build prisons, and we continue not to invest in affordable housing, not to invest in mental health treatment, not to invest in education, and instead we continue to invest in law enforcement and policing as a way to solve those problems. I think that's where we've gone wrong, and that's where we have to make a pivot and a change, is how we not so much cut police budgets, in my opinion, but how do we realistically add to budgets that address mental health, that address homelessness, that address drug addiction, so that police can deal with the very dangerous people, the murders, the rapists, the robbers, the domestic violence incidents, where they need to have a law enforcement personnel to arrest and to investigate, because there are dangerous people. One thing that I do not personally believe is talked enough about in this country as it relates to reimagining policing is this, especially compared to the rest of the civilized world, is the proliferation of illegal guns in our country. Policing is a dangerous job because people can get easy access to illegal guns. People are dangerous. They have guns. And that's a problem that the United States faces that really no other country faces. And that's something that we have to keep in the back of our mind as we have this conversation. That doesn't mean we don't have the conversation. That doesn't mean we don't have significant fruits in reimagining the way that we do police, because those changes are necessary. But I think we have to look at it realistically with the type of interactions police officers deal with, because we have made as a society a decision for the past 40 years to have the abundant, really unmitigated proliferation of guns in our community. And until we deal with the access to those illegal guns and how they are damaging and ruining cities and states and families and degrading neighborhoods and communities, until we wrap our head around that and we actually do something about it, society and policing will continue to be very dangerous.
Thank you, Zach. Kyle, I know a lot of your research has focused around reimagining community safety. Is there something that you'd like to add here, or a particular kind of unknown area here where you feel like it's really important for people to focus their attention.
Of course, yeah, no, so that's great, and thanks so much, Zach. So one of the things that I think is important is the conversation that we're having. First of all, I'm so glad we are having the conversation. I think wherever you fall on the spectrum of whether it's defund, abolish, reform, or wherever you fall on the spectrum, it is the result of movement organizers on the ground who have been pushing and have been doing this work for a very long time. And so what I think is important too, and especially I think in the midst of it during an election season, all this, I think people get caught up in phrasing and kind of some of the strategies around that. But what I do think is important here is that we are having this conversation because it shifts and moves the debate, right? We are talking about, wow, you know, even for people who you might not expect to be on board with maybe more radical approaches to this, you have people saying, you know what? The facts that we are using police to solve every single social problem in our society, that maybe is not the right approach. And that's how we start to move in the direction. I mean, most people don't even realize most of what police do. You know, it's mostly, most of the work is not focused on violent crime. There's a lot of, whether it comes to traffic issues or other non-criminal complaints that they're responding to, there's so much there that we have placed on police to tackle and address these other larger social problems. So we do have to have that conversation about where are we investing in terms of our budget, right? What is it that we are investing in? If we are going to make continued cuts to things like public education, things like healthcare, all these issues, and then expect us to now be in a situation where we're addressing things like inequality, poverty, despair, we're not going to get there. And so I think what we've learned and what we've seen is this idea, especially when it comes to economic justice, is where are we putting our dollars? Where are we investing our resources? And it really does come down to a question of what we think people deserve as a society. That's what this question is. And what we know then is that this is so racialized. This conversation is so racialized. The debate around policing has for a long time been about public safety and keeping you safe from people who commit all sorts of crimes. And we know that this is a racialized view to make black and brown people viewed as criminals or those in poverty or those as some sort of malice to society. And yet, at the same time, when presented with the option and opportunity to invest in these communities, to invest in people, we choose over and over again not to invest in our communities and instead to disinvest in these communities. And so we have to ask ourselves real questions about if we authentically believe that as a society, we want to have an opportunity where everybody can thrive. It means making sure people have the opportunity to live lives where they can thrive. That means investing in communities so they can get quality education. That means healthcare for all people. And that means dealing with the scourge of gun violence in this country more broadly, as we see what is happening and what City Attorney Klein just mentioned. There's so much there that I think people are shifting to, and they're realizing that, violent crime hasn't all of a sudden gone up if they made some of these shifts happen. And so there's more conversations, the jurisdiction by jurisdiction process of what they're trying to do, but it's about investing in what people more call a people's budget. That's a conversation they're having in Los Angeles. How are we investing in education, social services, those other things that aren't just policing to every single problem that we have?
Thank you. Okay. The next question that we have, I'm going to kind of combine two questions here, but they relate to training, right? That was one of the things that was mentioned initially when training specifically for police officers. Part of the initial portion of the question is it feasible to require that Columbus Police Department officers live within Columbus city limits or within Franklin County? I don't know if it's necessarily as opposed to the immersion experience, but perhaps in addition to the immersion experience that you mentioned, Zach. And then in addition to that, do you have training that is available for the city prosecutors? So kind of staying in training, but switching over to the prosecutors to make sure that they're aware of their own implicit bias. Again, similar to going at the same angle, right? So trying to make sure that the people who are making these potential life-changing decisions are aware of the implicit bias, whether it be because they're not from that community or otherwise.
So I'll start with the latter question. We, in addition to that 2-week-long training that we had when Adam Foss and the PI team came to Columbus, they do ongoing training with us and have come back to Columbus on a regular basis to do training that deal with the issues that have been raised, like implicit bias and others. We have done and will continue to do implicit bias training for my prosecutors and frankly for everyone in the city attorney's office. It shouldn't just be limited to prosecutors. Sorry, it's my daughter who's making chili. I'm doing something, sorry. Okay, you can have a ham and cheese sandwich, it's fine. Okay, and sparkly water, sure, okay. Sorry, this is the real time, sorry y'all. Yeah, you know what my kids, they're 8 and 5, what they're having for lunch. As it relates to the residency requirement, the Ohio Supreme Court struck down some residency provisions out of the city of Cleveland, but we do believe that there could be a legal avenue to have some sort of residency requirement. We're noodling that internally in the city attorney's office and what that would look like. And so I don't think I'm prepared to talk about it publicly, other than to note that the Ohio Supreme Court has weighed in on residency. There are other Ohio Revised Code provisions that do exist, and that, we'll continue to noodle it and do the legal analysis. But I appreciate the basis of that question. Which is, how do we have people that are serving the community, whether it's firefighters or police officers, have a broader access and participation in the communities in which they police or patrol or interact with? And I think that's a fair question and a fair statement.
Absolutely. Kyle, in your researcher experience, have you seen in perhaps other communities or across the nation where anything like that has been implemented, and seen any success or failure on that basis in terms of having people be more acquainted with the communities where they're serving?
Yeah, so that's great. So there's a couple things, I think that, to Zach's point, a lot of it, the ways in, there's a lot of constitutional concerns around some of this stuff. And so there are a lot of different provisions that cities and jurisdictions will look at in terms of, heavily incentivizing, perhaps in terms of having people who live in a particular jurisdiction to actually be more, relating to that particular jurisdiction that they're policing. But I think even some of those calls have now really even shifted of, well, those are some reforms that, might make some difference, but still at the end of the day, that hasn't got at a lot of the root of the problem, right? And so that alone doesn't deal with some of the systemic issues. And so what I want to be clear, though, is that, and this is what I think is important, is that there's a balance here that a lot of elected officials have to walk, but also a lot of departments have to walk, which is this idea about you can talk about police reform, but you also want to make sure that in that process, you aren't also undermining more transformational efforts to change systems, right? And so, because what tends to happen is you might say, oh, we checked off a few boxes, we do some trainings now, we do X, Y, and Z, and now as a result, we don't need to do this other larger process. And I think what's been exciting is to see those who've said, not only are we going to make reforms, but we also know that those reforms alone are not enough to deal with the wide scope of the issues. That's what we even see in our work with implicit bias trainings. We give implicit bias training to all sorts of organizations. So whether it's police departments or whether it's city agencies, whether it's school districts, we talk about issues of implicit bias, but we also know that trainings alone are not going to get at the root, right? And you've got to be able to have trainings to open the door to conversations, but you also have to be doing things like ongoing work on how does this align with the culture and practice of your organization? How does this align with the culture and practice of your city? And sadly, too often we see some folks in some places say, we've done a few trainings, we've done what we needed to do, and we're done, we're good to go. This is an ongoing process that we need people to be willing to make some changes around. The requirement around living requirements and residency requirements, that's one thing, but I don't think that alone is enough to get at some of these root issues that we need to be addressing.
Sure. Thank you. The next question that we're going to address, it sort of falls right in line with what we've been talking about, and that's being responsive to the communities that you're serving. The question as posed is looking specifically at the city attorney's office and what they're doing in order to immediately address the concerns of the actual community. So what sort of listening devices, so to speak, do you have to actually get feedback directly from the community so that you are sure that the policies and practices that you're trying to reform are in fact those that the community is most concerned about and that will have the most impact in those communities?
Well, one thing that I love about the city of Columbus is its diversity. And there's 900,000 people that live here. And I try to make a concerted effort to reach out to folks who represent a cross section of Columbus, including Kyle. Kyle and the Kerwin group, and as well as the legal groups and circles that he runs in. We've had many conversations over the past couple of weeks to get his perspective. By no means, though, does Kyle or any particular group represent all of the interests of the diverse groups and the people of the city of Columbus. Prior to COVID, it was certainly very, convenient to be able to go out, hold town halls, and be more accessible. That's obviously a little bit more challenging now because of coronavirus. But I will say, since my time that I have joined council, I have always maintained an open door policy. And so if there's anyone on this call that wants to do a one-on-one, a phone call or something about a particular idea, whether it's this policing or a different subject, that is the way that I approach public service. And I try to be accessible to everyone so that we can talk about different ideas, because I will say that the things that I present, by no means do I think are, a panacea or some sort of silver bullet solution that's going to cause all of society's problems to go away. In the same way of what Kyle was talking about. And when you look at these individual ideas, not one of them is going to solve everything. In the aggregate, hopefully they do break down systems and there's a continued conversation to make a difference. But I do not pretend to know all the answers. But what I do try to strive for is to have an open door policy to try to get to all the right answers by having important community dialogues and accessibility. And that will always continue as long as I'm a public servant.
Thank you. Kyle, I want to pitch this question to you, and then certainly, Zach, if you have additional comments, please jump in. But there's a question here about suggestions that you would have for smaller communities that don't deal necessarily with felony offenses, but also that don't necessarily have budgets and departments and social services and recovery resources available. How can they move the needle on racism as a public health crisis, or at least sort of cause reform to take place within their police and legal departments?
That's a great question. So one, I think the first question is whatever jurisdiction you're dealing with, it is approaching this more broadly than just the police departments, right? So what are you doing at a city level? Do you have an equity and inclusion plan more broadly? And obviously a key piece of that is what policing looks like. But one of the reasons why I think that's important is because we talk about a lot of this stuff has to do with ultimately public trust and whether people feel safe in their communities. Some people relay that as, well, I feel safe in my communities because I want more police to make me feel safe. Whereas others are often, especially the discussion we're talking about now, especially in a lot of Black and brown communities, of saying, I don't feel safe because I have police who are targeting me rather than addressing these root issues. So the first thing that you have to do is whatever city, whatever county, whatever area you're in, look at this at the city level, whether it's the mayor, or whether it's the city manager, and say, what is your plan around equity and inclusion and addressing issues like racial justice? And this is something that I think people are, especially in some of these smaller towns, are uncomfortable talking about. Because even talking about issues of race, talking about issues of community safety makes some people uncomfortable. But we have to be talking about these issues. I can't tell you enough the calls that we filled at the Kerwin Institute from cities or places that are basically saying, I don't really know how to talk about race. Like, we haven't really even figured out ways to talk about race, and let alone policing. We can't even talk about the issues of race in our community. And what I think is important is that, especially in the debate and conversation we have right now, just talking about race alone, that's not divisive. Not talking about race, that is divisive, and race and racism specifically, because what we see in the dialogue and the debate is people say, well, let's just not talk about these issues because they're divisive. When instead, if we aren't talking about those issues, you are erasing the lived experiences of so many in your community. And the first thing of any sort of equity and inclusion plan that any city or any community needs to have is, what is your community voice look like? How are you listening to community stakeholders? And not only are you giving them a platform to speak, but are they actually included in the process? Because sometimes people say, well, we've reached out to community members, we've asked them to talk about issues, but no one's come forward, or we've only had a few people come forward. It might be because they don't feel that their concerns or their voices are going to be taken seriously or actually truly listened to. So I think the first thing you all would have to do is, one, there's a couple things you can do as a citizen or as a resident of this community, which is reach out to the local mayor, city manager, council leaders, and see what they're doing in terms of a community listening process that goes beyond just the hearings that they're holding. And then the other piece too is letter to the editors, writing about these issues, saying we need to have these conversations and dialogues, and really forcing the conversation for civic organizations and other associations to broaden this conversation, to talk about policing, yes, but to go more broadly about equity and inclusion in all practices and jurisdictions.
Thank you. The next question is looking at, so our topic today generally is looking at public trust in policing. And so we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the initial encounters with police and how that can have an impact on community trust, and whether it's looking at reducing those encounters or changing the way that they take place. But the other side of that is those who have already been affected, right? And so this question speaks to that. So with systemic racism playing a part in maximum or harsh sentencing of nonviolent crimes, which we talked about before, what do you each suggest to sort of fix those sentences or restore the lives of those that maybe were unjustly sentenced? And then more specifically here in Columbus or in Ohio more generally, can you point to any initiatives that are addressing that issue?
Well, I'll revert back to the diversion program that I referenced earlier, that looks at the root reasons of why someone commits crime, where we partner with a third-party independent healthcare group that can screen defendants, identify the root reasons of why they're interacting with the criminal justice system, and then tailor specific plans to that individual as part of a diversion. And it literally are things that if food insecurity, jumps out based on your questions and answers, then part of your diversion is to go to your food pantry and know that is in the community in which you live. And that is a way, I think, to not focus on convictions, but to focus on recidivism as a way to make our community safer. I also, in a bipartisan way, helped author Senate Bill 3, which is a drug sentencing overhaul plan for the state of Ohio. It takes felony 4, felony 5 drug possession cases, and with the exception of date rape drugs and fentanyl, it downgrades all of those felony 4 and felony 5s to be an unclassified misdemeanor. Again, moving away from the life sentence of a felony conviction that carries with you for the rest of your life, that prevents people from getting housing, prevents people from getting jobs, and how we can look at it from an addiction standpoint and curing and trying to help identify and solve addiction and build people up to give them the tools that they need to make to be the moms and dads that they want to be. And so, like, trying to rethink how we not only sentence in the courtroom by doing diversion programs, but also how do we work with the legislature to change the laws. And what I've, kind of come to the conclusion, I'd be curious to hear Kyle's thoughts on this, but like the over felonization of conduct in our society. That doesn't mean that conduct still shouldn't be criminal. That's a different conversation, but should it be a felony? Because we have created as a society, both socially and legally, significant barriers if you have a felony conviction. And I'll give an example, a real world example that has come to me to weigh in on. In addition to being the city attorney, I, for the past almost 20 years, I referee Division I women's college basketball, and there's a reason why I'm bringing this up. It's not just random, but there's a bill in the State House that wants to move from a misdemeanor to a felony if you assault a referee, and so reporters have called me and they have said, well, you're a referee, you're probably really for this, are you not? And the reality is I'm not in favor of it. Not that I'm pro assaulting a referee. I mean, I'm a pretty good referee, but I've been chased out of gyms a couple times. And thankfully I've never been involved in an altercation. I certainly wouldn't want someone to strike me or hit me, but if someone did strike me or hit me because I'm a referee, should that be a felony? But that's the thought process that we have because we have been ingrained for decades about being tough on crime. Now, I do think that because of opioids and because opioids have afflicted people who live in the suburbs, primarily white people, while for decades addiction has afflicted communities of color in rural America, and it got largely unignored for decades. But because of opioids, I think people have moved away from this tough on crime approach and said, well, this addiction thing is real. And they've moved towards a realization that we need to be more pragmatic and smart on crime. I do think we have more runway to rethink at a state level with state laws that from the Ohio Revised Code that describe felony conduct and differentiate that from misdemeanor conduct. I do think we have this unique opportunity to address some of the over-felonization of conduct. And I think Senate Bill 3 is an important step forward. So it's not just within the four corners of the courtroom. It's when you look at the law and what the legislature has told us to do, you have to fix that as well.
Absolutely. And Kyle, before you jump in, I just want to clarify, because I think I didn't quite articulate the question in the way that the person asking it wanted it answered. And that is looking at people who have already been sentenced and are now trying to re-enter society, people who have sort of already had that impact happen to them. I think that the measures that you discuss going forward are still relevant, but to be responsive to, I think, what they were getting at, they're looking at what is being done or what do you think should be done for those who have already been impacted?
Well, so thanks for the clarification, Kari. The Ohio Revised Code sets up a process where applicants can seek expungement, they can seek sealings of their records, and we are fairly intentional in reviewing those and try to only weigh in if we truly believe that the allowance of a sealing or an allowance of an expungement would be a threat to society. We only weigh in on limited circumstances, and we really want to empower folks to point them in the right direction to advocate for sealing and expungement so they can turn their lives around. And so they can clean up their record and actually have an opportunity to succeed. And then again, holistically speaking, I think it is laws like Senate Bill 3 where you recognize that folks who are afflicted by addiction shouldn't have a felony conviction that follows them the rest of their life. And then we have to rethink laws generally to move away from felony conduct unless it's necessary. For example, the rapes, the murders, the robbers, the human traffickers, the arsonists. There are people who should be labeled felons. There are very dangerous people, but we have over felonized conduct, and I think we need to have a reckoning and a realization and a conversation about how we can figure out, first, should the conduct be criminalized, and then second, if it should, does it really need to be a felony?
Thanks. And Kyle, I'm certain that there are some things that you would like to add. Please do.
I think Zach really did a great job of summing up a lot of these issues in terms of the over-felonization piece. There are so many collateral consequences that come with having a record, right? And this is something that we have dealt with. We have not dealt with as a society. We again, now that we're talking about the movement, the necessary right movement to not just over-criminalize things, what are we doing with all the folks who have a record for these things that would have been crimes or that were marked as crimes then? And I think that's something when we talk about any sort of reforms when it comes to these issues, we have to be talking about retroactivity, right? So we have to be talking about the amount of times that people are kept out from a job opportunity, kept out from so many aspects of our society because they have a record that they can't get removed from their record. That's something that we have to be addressing and talking about immediately. Any sort of reform has to be looking at retroactivity as well, especially as the damage done from the war on drugs. And then also, I think more broadly, we do have to have a conversation around not just a society that is, and this is a much harder conversation to have because we are a tough on crime type of society, but not just a society that provides opportunities for rehabilitation for nonviolent crimes, but there are opportunities where you have violent offenders who, when going through all the processes, will eventually re-enter into society. And you've got to make sure that there are processes in place in which re-entering into society, we can keep people safe, and we can give people the opportunity and the resources to have so that people thrive as a community as a whole. This is something that is very difficult to deal with and to address, but we've got to be able to have that conversation too, because people, and this I think goes into a broader conversation at the federal level, things like the death penalty. I personally believe we need to abolish the death penalty. And I especially believe when it comes down to the racially disparate outcomes and the discrimination and the fact that you have wrongful conviction rates that also lead to the death penalty, these are all issues that go into the society that we're in now. And a lot of stuff around Brian Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative, talk a lot about what it tells us about a society that executes its own people. And these are deep, hard questions, of course, because we know, especially when we talk about violent offenders, but there are other issues here that we at the root of our view of just punishing everything and using punishment as a system of deterrence has not worked. That alone has not worked. We have to be talking about rehabilitation, reinvesting in community resources, and looking at the root issues that go beyond just crime, but also things like poverty and investing in communities more broadly.
Thank you. The next group of questions I'm going to sort of pair together here are looking at the use of excessive force. Generally speaking, it's been documented in the Columbus area that there are some areas where they've scored rather poorly as it relates to excessive force. And then what role, if any, does the city attorney's office have when it comes to punishing police who engage in misconduct or who engage in excessive force? And then what are prosecutors going to do going forward if an officer does not exhaust de-escalation options before escalating the use of force in Columbus?
Well, as the group knows, because it's a bunch of lawyers, the United States Supreme Court has given a lot of runway for the allowance of police officer conduct as it relates to the definition of use of force. With that said, if an officer commits a misdemeanor crime and it is outside the officer's authority as an officer to use that force, and it rises to the level of misdemeanor, say for example, misdemeanor assault, then that officer commits a crime, or she commits a crime, then it can be prosecuted by a municipal prosecutor, in this instance, the Columbus City Attorney's Office. The same can be true for excessive force that is rise to the felony level. If it's outside the constitutional jurisdictions and an officer oversteps his or her bounds and commits a felony, notably, George Floyd, a police department can investigate that, or an investigatory body can investigate that incident, present it to the federal or the county prosecutor for prosecution. If you look at the most recent protests and the allegations of police misconduct, those were all submitted to the city of Columbus, the Department of Public Safety, in conjunction with my office and my chief prosecutor, Joe Gibson. They went through and reviewed all of the submissions. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of submissions. Now, there could have been several submissions on one incident, but we received hundreds of responses. And my team, Joe Gibson and the Department of Public Safety, went through each one and put them into certain buckets. They put them in the this is a complaint about policing generally bucket. They put it into the this is appears to be alleged officer misconduct, but does not appear to be criminal bucket. And they put it into this is alleged officer misconduct, and it could be criminal. And an independent FBI agent who's retired is reviewing all of those potential criminal claims. We have an independent prosecutor that we're bringing on board to review them. And if an officer broke the law and committed an assault, then that officer could be prosecuted and frankly should be prosecuted. But the flip side is also true. And that's why we're working with the Columbus Division of Police for the protesters. We have taken a particular focus on protesters who have committed violent crimes and protesters who have committed crimes of destruction. And we're working with the Division of Police to hold those protesters accountable too. I think that the community wants and demands accountability for police, but they also want accountability for those that commit violence and those who may have destroyed our community and had no intention of engaging in First Amendment protected protest activity. So our goal in the prosecutor's office as it relates to the protest, but I think it addresses the general question and generally, is that we want to make sure that regardless of whether it's a law enforcement officer or regardless of whether it's a civilian, that people are treated equally. And I think it's the inequity that has been present in the criminal justice system for years. That was one of the underlying reasons why people were protesting, was that the difference between the way police officers, they believe, people in the community certainly believe that there was never enough accountability for police officers. We want to make sure there is accountability for police officers and protesters.
Thank you. Anything that you'd like to add to that, Kyle, before we move on?
No, I think one of the big pieces that I just want to get at again is looking at some of these root causes, these root issues that we continuously, as a society, will kick the can down the road because we do not want to address these root issues. And so we have to make sure that when we're looking at these issues, that none of this is happening in a vacuum, right? These are underlying disparities that exist within not just the criminal justice system, but our society more broadly. And until we're willing to address that, we will continue to see these problems over and over again. And no one reform is going to address it. So we've got to make sure we're willing to have jurisdictions both look at both the short term, but also the longer term systemic practices. And then also recognize, like, especially when it comes to the criminal justice system, there are so many different actors that play a role, right? So you've got judges, you got to have a conversation about judges. You also have conversation about prosecutors, police departments. There are so many different actors that play a role. But when it comes to excessive force of police, there is a culture that we need to make sure that there's accountability and systemic enforcement and systemic accountability at place. And if that means the DOJ getting involved with consent decrees or whatever that might mean, that's what it might have to mean. There are instances where processes can happen. However, given the way that our laws have been structured and the Supreme Court has given so much immunity for police officers, that you do see this limited accountability time and time again. So we've got to figure out more ways that we can hold officers accountable for excessive use of force and not just again and again move, just kind of push the can down the road. So when you talk about a civilian review board, what does that discipline authority look like? Are we just recommending discipline decisions and then leaving that up to the police chief to decide? I mean, there's all these different factors that play a role that I think requires intentional engagement and wholesale reform in order to change and address that problem.
Thank you. The next questions that I'm going to sort of group together here are going back to the way that our police officers and police stations, that's not the right word, but the way that they're funded, right? And so there's been talk about shifting potential resources from one area to another. And then Zach, earlier you mentioned that rather than doing that, you just like to add those additional funds, right, to the other resources that may need to be involved. But there's a statistic here that was offered from Campaign Zero, the End Broken Window Policing report, where only 5% of arrests made in 2018 involved alleged violent crimes, and 4% of what police spend their time doing overall involves enforcing violent crimes. And so why wouldn't it be justifiable to take the funds that we're giving to the police department to move to social services. And then similarly, if you are investing in programs to bring on social workers or others for handling those types of issues, it would necessarily then mean taking over certain responsibilities from the police and moving them to these other areas. So again, why would that not decrease the need for funding?
Let me, I guess, clarify. I suppose it could. And what I was trying to say earlier is I wouldn't blanketly say cut the police budget or blanketly say increase it. What I can say, though, is that when reimagining policing at its simplest form, and this is a very complicated subject, but breaking it down at its simplest form is, on the one hand, looking at it from a job description of what do we want police to do? If you were going to write a job description for police in your community, what would you want those police officers to do? And let's say, for example, you come up with 10 bullet points of what you want them to do. And then you add, on the other hand, you say, well, what do we currently ask police officers to do? Well, that list may have 40 bullet points. And so that delta between the 10 and the 40, that 30 delta, like that's where I think we have the ability to reimagine policing. And that may mean an increase or decrease in police budget, and it may and likely will require an increase in other areas in our community, as Kyle has spoken eloquently about housing, about food, about education, about healthcare. And I don't think that you should necessarily blanketly think one thing as it relates to a police budget at the regard or disregard of the other. So in my opinion, if you are looking at how police, and it's interesting about this Campaign Zero, because there's also a New York Times piece that I would encourage folks to take a look at, is the New York Times piece in a very similar way the Campaign Zero looked at the 5% violent crime time. They looked at the 10 of the largest, it wasn't the 10 largest police departments, but 10 of the largest, including, Cincinnati was on the list. So these are pretty decent sized cities in the United States. They looked at how do police officers spend their time? And statistically speaking, in those 10 of the largest police departments, police officers spend about 50% of their time on what the article described as non-criminal enforcement or non-criminal response, and a combination of that and traffic enforcement. And that included speeding tickets and traffic accidents. So if police officers are spending 50% of their time doing paperwork associated with accidents, that's where we can reimagine and figure out how we can have police focus on the things we want them to focus on, which I think would be violence, it would be guns, it would be the human trafficking, the rapes, the murders. And that allows us to reimagine how we can use funds either out of a police budget or out of a new line item it's all going to be community specific of how each community wants to address it. But how do we take funds and then address it in social work, we address it in homelessness, we address it in mental health and drug addiction. And I still think, because I think the unfortunate and very tragic death of the officer in Toledo, it's my understanding that individual was dealing with a potential mental health problem. I think that underscores, if true, that you're not taking police out of the equation necessarily. It's just, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily have to be a primary contact. The primary contact can be with someone who's trained to deal with social work, to deal with mental health, and police, because situations can get dangerous. Police can be there in a supportive role, but the interaction itself may not have to be with someone with a badge and a gun who, goes up to someone and then starts the interaction. All these conversations, I think, should be on the table for every community as they reimagine policing. And I'm not trying to suggest the way I'm throwing it out there should be the way it's done, as much as I'm suggesting as these are the types of conversations that we need to have based on the feedback I've received from the community and the feedback, frankly, what I've seen nationwide in the response of how we rethink policing.
Thank you, Zach. Kyle, I want to turn to you. Certainly you can add to that question as well, but there's a question that's posed specifically to you for the top 3 things that you would recommend that the city do right now to improve police relations.
The top three, that's a great question. That's a very hard question. I think there's a lot of issues that have to be addressed, and I think there's a lot of things on the table. I mean, I think what I would see this more is in terms of a kind of a principle type of pieces. What are we looking at in terms of what values are we trying to set forth? One is, and I think they're having this conversation about the demilitarization of police forces, right? The fact that we have police that are walking around the city that look like it's a war zone, I think we need to address. And so we need to have conversations about demilitarizing our police force. The conversations about making sure that you're not having a platform for white supremacists or those involved in hate groups. I mean, that's something that everybody should be on board with, and make sure that you don't have police officers involved in that. And then, of course, a civilian review board, but one that has authority in teeth to it. And I think there are going to be obviously further discussions that the working group and others are going to have about what exactly that means. And of course, you have the collective bargaining contract that's going to be on the table. But you have to have a conversation about what it actually means to have some sort of authority and oversight that actually has teeth, in addressing that and making sure that we're addressing these issues in a holistic way and holistic manner, and not simply recommending something that doesn't actually ever get implemented and you don't see any sort of authority. But again, what I would look at even more broadly than that is where we are investing our resources and our money and our budgets. We need to be investing in our social services and our healthcare, our housing. We need to be looking at our policies when it comes to eviction. The facts are that we have eviction right now that have to take place at a convention center to make sure that we are churning out eviction rates in the middle of a pandemic. This was already an issue prior to the pandemic, and then it is an issue now. And the reason why I think that's important is because if somebody doesn't have a place to live, they get caught up in poverty, they get caught up in all sorts of issues, and then and we know as a society, we criminalize poverty, we criminalize people who are struggling. And so as a result, you get caught up and can get caught up and mixed up in the justice system. So when it looks at police relations, we not only have to look at, okay, what are we doing as far as budgets, but also where are our investments going as a society, and why is it that we are continuing to evict people in the middle of a pandemic? I mean, that is absolutely just unbelievable to me, that we have to be addressing it and making sure that people have the resources that they need to thrive at this moment and really just survive. Like, people are trying to survive long before the pandemic, and then the pandemic has only added on additional problems and additional issues. That's something at both the city, county level we've got to be able to address, state level, but then of course federally we've got to be able to address these issues.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue into what might end up being our last group of questions, just based on the time. But one of the questions deals with eviction cases and how for underrepresented defendants, it sort of dooms them to lose and then have judgments that will limit their ability to apply for housing after eviction. And so the question is, could the city attorney's office influence any sort of legislation change in the landlord-tenant provisions of ORC to require that to require leases to state that unhappy tenants can escrow their rent so that they're not evicted for non-payment of rent in situations where they're withholding due to the conditions that they're living in?
Well, it's my understanding that escrow is the right policy approach. Is the current policy approach, that if you are escrowing and you're able to, you cannot be evicted for escrowing if you have an outstanding problem or issue with your landlord. As a matter of fact, Columbus passed some retaliatory eviction legislation within the city limits. But to answer the question directly, yes, if there's a way for me to influence policy at the state level on this topic or others, we always try to figure out how we can build in a bipartisan way successful legislation that's going to improve the lives of others. As the folks know on this call, it's a very heavily Republican legislature. They have near super majorities as well as controlling the governor's office. So you have to have, the Republican help to get stuff passed under the way the current legislature's juxtaposition and composition is. So we were successful in Senate Bill 3 to get it out of the Senate. It's now in the House. There's no guarantee it's going to get out of the House. But we are going to work hard to do that. And if there's an ability to change landlord-tenant law to more directly help tenants, that makes sense, that can promote the public good, then my office wants to stand ready to support that. We have already had regular conversations with our friends over at Legal Aid on how we can be a participant to help them through the eviction process, or be a resource to them, because we firmly believe in having fair representation for tenants.
Okay, thank you. Similarly, again, looking at the types of charges, or the types of offenses that affect community and police relations, are you considering dismissing all driving under suspension, or driving without a license, or no operations license charges, as those add lots of fines and can have a disproportionate impact on undocumented people that are facing fear that those charges will alert ICE to their presence, and then because they're not able to get licenses? Any comments on that?
Well, this is, again, speaking of weighing in at the state level, this is certainly a place, because of how fines are stacked against folks, specifically as it relates to driving privilege related laws. We have a goal in the city attorney's office, is how do we get folks legal? Like, how do we work with them and point them in the right direction and connect them with the BMV? We even had conversations of the possibility of weighing in with the governor's office of trying to get a BMV in the Franklin County Courthouse, just so it's so much easier for those who have driving under suspensions or other driving related problems, where they don't have to go to Morse Road or go to Kinney Road and then wait 2 or 3 hours, like actually having a BMV there at the courthouse for them to work to get on payment plans. I do understand the questioner's concern, and I agree with the concern as it relates to undocumented individuals. As a matter of fact, we've had defense attorneys reach out to us in fear that maybe ICE would take their client, and we've tried to work with that defense attorney not to excuse the underlying law that was violated, but how do we work with that defense attorney so that his or her client can come in without the fear of retaliation from ICE, and we try to be as accommodating as possible. If it is possible, in working with that lawyer, and we've done that on a couple of different occasions.
Thank you. There's a question here that deals with Columbus's level of preparation and the ways in which you're continually moving that ball forward. And particularly as it relates to a Portland-like situation, what role would Columbus Police play should federal law enforcement appear on our streets? Has there been consideration as to that? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, we've had a lot of conversation over the past couple of days on this topic, some of which probably is within the protection of attorney-client privilege that I won't specifically weigh in on, and I hope the questioner appreciates that, since this is the Columbus Bar Association. But I will say that, in my opinion, federal enforcement personnel are not welcomed in the city of Columbus. We don't want them to come. We don't need them to be here. I have grave constitutional concerns over what I have seen in Portland. Namely, you have unmarked individuals who are dressed head to toe in camo, that even wear goggles and have their eyes covered. So they're literally dressed head to toe in camo, that are snatching people off the street in these snatch and grab operations and throwing them in the back of unmarked cars. We have no idea who those people are. They could be federal personnel. They could be human traffickers. They could be drug cartel. We don't know. But I would hope, and I would encourage, that if an interaction ever happened like that within the Columbus city limits, and law enforcement personnel witnessed it and did not know it was federal personnel for sure, then they should stop that interaction and question those individuals. And if a crime was committed by those individuals, then those people should be held accountable. They do not have immunity to act under a pretense of law that doesn't exist just because they have the blessing of the President of the United States for political and campaign ploys to enter large urban cities and cause destruction and chaos and potentially break the law. Now, if the officer finds that the interaction between those participants was legal, for example, based on an arrest warrant issued by a federal judge or a violation of a federal law, then that's a permissible use of federal activity because a violation of federal law occurred. But to think that unidentifiable federal agents or troopers are going to come into Columbus, because we do not have a national police in this country, but are going to come into Columbus to enforce local and state laws where they have no authority to do so, I think is a gross violation of the Constitution, and it's a gross violation of federalism. And I would be one to rush directly to the federal courthouse to try to prevent that activity from happening in our own backyard.
Thank you. We have just about 3 minutes or just under that before we are finished for the day. And so I'd just like to offer the floor to each of you for some closing remarks before we end the conversation, at least as it exists on this Zoom call.
Why don't you start, Kyle? I feel like I talked a lot.
Yeah, of course. So one, thank you so much for having me. And again, Zach, I mean, that's the perfect answer, right? I mean, when we're talking about a violation of people's constitutional rights, I mean, this is something that needs to be addressed. And so I'm glad to know that we have that here in Columbus. So that is good to hear, to have leaders who believe in that. Ultimately what I would say is, this conversation is a difficult one because it requires us to have uncomfortable conversations about what needs changed. But what we can't lose sight of is the reason why a lot of these conversations have picked up. That's the killing of George Floyd. We see the killing of Breonna Taylor, and we see the officers aren't arrested there. I mean, there are so many other issues that we have seen time and time again where there has been a systemic culture of this sort of violence, and of course with systemic racism that permeates all throughout, that erodes trust. And so for us to say that we're just going to do mere reforms around the edges is not enough to address the real lived experiences of far too many people in this country and in this community, especially for Black people and Black and brown people especially. And we know that no matter where you stand on this issue, that if the movements and the protests have not moved you, it is important for you to recognize that you have to step outside the sidelines and recognize what role you can play in addressing these big issues. These are obviously systemic changes, and only of us have a certain amount of areas and jurisdictions that we have control over. However, we can be a part of a larger systemic effort here, and it requires us to speak truth to power, to be able to hold our elected officials accountable, but then also talk about what are we doing to address these issues. And because I think, unfortunately, we've been too open to the idea of trying to just talk around these issues and not get at the root. When we think about crime, when we think about issues of eviction, all these things, some of the root causes here, people don't have basic resources because we've denied that opportunity for people. We have seen them as not deserving as having resources. When we know that as a society, we're going to root out systemic racism and address the issue of community trust, we actually have to build upon all these issues, and that means investing in our communities, not just punishing people and throwing the key away. And I'm just grateful to be a part of the conversation. I think we all have a role to play.
Thank you. Zach, you've got about 30 seconds or so.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks to the Bar Association. And I think, we should be grateful that people like Kyle Strickland, as smart as he is and talented as he is in our community thinking about these things and helping us all try to be a better place. I mean, the reality is George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the coronavirus, it removed the wool over people's eyes to identify some really cultural, historical, systematic racial barriers that exist in the justice system, that exist in healthcare, that exist in education, that no system or process in our society is immune to having one or several barriers that are based solely on race, primarily and secondarily class. And we have our work cut out for us. And the reason I became an elected official is to make a difference, to improve people's lives. And we live in this really special, unique, stressful time where we all collectively, whether you're an elected official or a leader at the Kirwan Institute or a member of the Bar Association, have a role to play to address them. because each one of the people on this call have an expertise, whether it's in criminal justice or healthcare law or education law, banking law, and some of the redlining that has taken place. Like, we all have a role to play to continue to advocate when they see an injustice or an inequity, and not only call it out, which is important, but propose a solution of how we can fix it. And advocate and tell our friends and our families that this isn't some liberal idea or a conservative idea. Like, this is just the right thing to do when we want to create real, fair opportunities for success for all Americans. Because you can create an opportunity that's unrealistic, or you can create an opportunity that's fair and achievable for individuals. And how do we create those real, fair, achievable opportunities for families, primarily people of color, African Americans, who have been shorted for decades on actually trying to achieve them? And we have this real opportunity now to level that playing field, and it's up for all of us to take advantage of it.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to close out today with, again, a special thank you to our guest. I'm already receiving really positive feedback about your contributions, and we thank you again both for being here. I want to just take a final moment here for those of you who have enjoyed today's conversations and want to be able to continue to have conversations like these. We have heard your cry. We'll be looking at different aspects of the criminal justice system in the coming months, beginning with jury selection, sentencing, and specialty dockets on August 20th, again via Zoom from 12 to 1:30. And then in September, we'll be looking at parole, probation, and becoming productive on September 10th from 12 to 1:30. So we hope that you will join us again for those conversations, and we'll have different panelists for those as well. Thank you so much on behalf of the Columbus Bar Association. Thank you for being here, and we hope to continue the conversation with you soon. Thanks again.